online space somewhere. We are going to continue our conference. This is the afternoon session with one in-person presentation and one online presentation. The first one is by Jacquelien van Stekelenburg. Very good, thank you. And she is actually a professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences in Sociology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, or Free University Amsterdam in English. And the title of your presentation, as we agreed, actually, the move from electoral to protest politics in the Netherlands and beyond. Certainly, what I would like to hear from you a little bit is the experience in the Netherlands, especially how Geert Wilders got quite a lot of support from the electorate. But as we agreed, you are not a political scientist, but a social psychologist. So you want to go beyond the very political events, and you are not going to talk only about the Netherlands. So the floor is yours, and you have about 15 minutes.
Lovely. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks for pushing me the button. Let me first start by, as you might have seen, I've changed the title a little bit, and especially to connect it to a study that we have written a proposal for in the meantime. It is under review. It's a Horizon Europe proposal. So I kind of seize the opportunity to already tell you about this proposal, because I think somehow that the questions that we have and the dilemmas that we encounter really kind of boil down to what this proposal is about. So I take the freedom, and we of course have had a chat about this, to tell you already about it, but be aware, it is still under review. So I'm not 100% sure. I can be more specific, 7% sure that we will get the money to do the review, to do the study. Okay, what is important in this study is that we depart from two trends at the same time. The first one is a declining turnout. And what you can see here is an overview of the turnout for European elections. I thought, well, how accurate can we be and how close can we be to the current events? And what you see here is that there is a decline and a decline and a decline, and suddenly in 2019 there is an increase. That is an interesting question. Why is this increase, and will it continue in June to see this increase? Another trend that we see is related to protests. Protests are on the rise throughout the whole world, and especially in the Western world. I have to be more specific even. In the Western democratic world, we see an explosion of protests over the last 15 years, so to say. And that raises the question whether this is in a even comparable way. So are the people who are voting also the ones who are protesting? What is going on here actually? Or are people who distrust politics, are they going onto the streets? I think what we see here is the basic dynamics of democracy for the coming decades, so to say. The reason is the following, that we actually don't know. And I think it's extremely important, and also raises the question, should we worry? And I start as an, optimist by nature, I would say. I think we should. I think we should worry. And I try to kind of walk you through the reasons why I think we should worry. On the one hand, you could think it's a good thing, right? If people protest, it's people who take up their democratic responsibility, their citizenship, they're active, they're participating, they're criticizing the regime. Great, great stuff. Is it? Well, there we will go. And I will try to kind of walk you to 3 democratic outcomes that, in my view, are important in the question, is it indeed a good thing for democracy, for democratic countries, to see this move from electoral to protest politics? And I will walk you through representativity, responsivity, and accountability. Okay, first we start with the electoral arena. It is emptying, less and less people study, but, and there it becomes important, this is really like the beginning of my argument why we should worry. There is a bias. The first bias is created by high and lower educated people. We see that it is especially the lower educated people who tend to leave the electoral arena. And then if we have a look at age, there we see in a way a bias again. Here the bias is towards the older people are more inclined to protest or to cast their vote than the younger people. And then if we combine those two, so we have a look at low educated people and high and older high educated people. And what do we see here? That it's a very, very important difference. So what you see is that the older people are and the higher educated they are, the more they are willing to cast their votes. People with a weaker position in society, they are not casting their votes anymore. We can see it here. 44% of people in the UK with a low education, young people, they are the only ones who vote. So I think we can clearly see here a bias around age and about educational level. It's a bit small. Can you see it? Okay, I walk you through it. This is the request on Wilders and what we see in the Netherlands at the moment. What we see here is on political trust in parliament. And the Netherlands is a classic high trust country, but it is on the decline. At the moment, the most recent findings show that only 25% of the Dutch people trust politics. We are normally around 55 to 60%. So you see an enormous decline, and we are entering an era of a low trust country. And then it becomes important to see whether there might be a difference in what type of party identification people have. And what do we see? We see that in general, the more moderate middle parties, so to say, they have still high trust in politics. I'm talking about the Liberals, the Labour Party, but then, and I'll point it to you, you might see these outliers, so to say. They have low trust in politics, and these are the PVV, Wilders, and the people who do not cast a vote, and the Forum for Democratie, which is comparable to Wilders, but perhaps even more, well, I would say more extreme at the moment. So what we can see here is that trust in politics and party identification are strongly related. And then if we have a look, this is our last elections, the outcome of the last elections. And you can see that Geert Wilders Well, I think you've read it in the newspapers as well, or seen it on television. He won the elections. Still, we are in the process of organizing a government, but I'm afraid it will turn out in a few weeks. Then you already know what position I have. Just to have a look, like, is this new? Is this whole wave of populism, is it new? No, it's not. This is from 2015 and 2019. And what you can see is that here we see an enormous increase for Forum of Democratie, and they won the elections those days. So what I hear a lot is that people say, like, it is really because of Corona, and it's emphasized, it strengthened the distrust in government. I don't think that is a correct interpretation, even as not being a political scientist. I think what is really important is to see that this pool of sentiment, so to say, for populism has been already around for a longer period. And then going to Europe, I found that interesting, especially also listening to the first panel. I found this overview. It is from 1998 to 2018, and it looks at the share of populism, far left, far right, and other populists. I think you were talking about other populists as well, right? Well, here you see other populists as well. And what we see is that especially the far right populists increased enormously over voting in Europe. And well, there was someone who was positive about, yeah, you had, well, optimist thoughts about the upcoming elections. If we have a look at this, even despite the fact that I already said I am an optimist, I'm a bit concerned what will happen with this trend of populist voting in the EU. Should we bother? I think we should. And this is a study by one of my research master students, and she tried to study whether party identification increased affective polarization. So the more you identify with your party, the more you hate your neighbors or other groups in society. And her reasoning was that it is created by conspiracy thinking. So your party, your politicians, they use all kinds of stories, and the more they use these type of stories of us versus them, the elite versus the people, the more you start to polarize. That was her way of thinking. And it's always good if you started in science if it's not true, if it turns out not to be true. So what we found, what she found, I should say, is that party identification indeed leads, the more you identify with a political party, the more you feel affective polarized. But it was not predicted by conspiracy thinking. And then she divided the sample in people who identify with a moderate party and those with a populist signature. And what did we find? Indeed, there is what we find, that the more you identify with your populist party, the more you believe the conspiracy, the little lies here and there about us versus them, the more you believe those, and the more you start to effectively hate people around you. So should we worry about populist voting? I think we should. It has a clear effect in society, how we connect to each other. The social cement of a society is influenced by party identification with populist politicians. Then, just a small summary, and then we go to the protest arena. What we see, and this is to kind of steer my argument that the electoral arena and the power in the electoral arena is biased through a few trends that we see. Lower educated and young are underrepresented in the electoral arena. Populist voting is increasing. Trust in politics is declining, especially for people who vote for populist parties. And effective polarization is increasing, especially for voters who vote for populist parties. So the electoral arena, who are still there, are the higher educated and the lower educated who cast a vote for a populist party. I would say this is concerning, but it also raises the question like, hey, are these people then perhaps departing politics altogether, or are they going to the protest arena? Another way of doing politics, so to say, to influence power in the system and in the country. Do they move to the protest arena? And you might wonder in the meantime, like, what's this tango pair doing there? The abbreviation, the acronym of the proposal is tango, because the proposal, the call was really about protest. And they said, the world is changing, protest is changing. Oh, can you study that for us? And then we thought, yeah, but if you only study that aspect, you actually only study half of the story. You also need to see the tango, the democratic tango, between authority and between the protesters. How do authorities, politicians react to the protest? Do they repress it? What do they do with it? If we only look at protest, we will only learn the half of the story. So that's why we thought, no, you need to study the full democratic dance, and that became the tango. So that's why you see the tango here. And I hope you will hear a lot about tango the coming years. That would imply that we got our grant, but I'm not sure. Okay, the move to the protest arena. Indeed, protests are on the rise. I already mentioned it. Interesting EU barometer shows us that EU youngsters find protest more effective than voting. This is something, please think it through, what that implies. Lower educated are underrepresented, higher educated are overrepresented in protests. So we clearly see a biased representation in the protest arena. Young from electoral to protest arena, higher educated represented in both. So they already have a powerful position in terms of social class, but also they know how to influence politics. Both arenas, and the lower educated seem to leave politics altogether. And the protest arena is growing. Okay, but there is more to democratic outcomes of protest participation. And this, what I mean by there is more that creates a bias in who protests and who not. The first one is related to do the authorities facilitate or repress the protests? And there we see a systematic bias. There is not that much, well, I should say academic studies on this at the moment. We found two studies, one from the Human Rights Watch and one from Amnesty, and they clearly show that marginal groups encounter two demotivating aspects. One, they encounter more repression. For instance, with the Black Lives Matter protest, much more people were repressed and taken by the police. And they also encounter higher barriers. Then another aspect, and when we talk about democracy and whether protest is indeed a way to pressurize, to influence the authorities to get power, what politics is about in the end. then the question is, what do authorities do when there is a protest by group A or group B? Do they react in a similar way, or don't they do so? So in this study, there is no material on this. We couldn't find any material. If you know about it, please let me know. We couldn't find anything. We are interested whether there is a bias, systematic bias in how authorities react to claims made in a protest. Do they neglect them? Do they repress them? Do they absorb them? And only then is our thing, we could really see whether the move from electoral to protest politics, what that does to democratic deficits. We think, with what we've seen up till now, but we need data, we need studies, that there are new democratic deficits looming. EU youth, I just mentioned it, they have more faith in protest and electoral politics, but are their voices fair and democratic absorbed? We don't know. So are they listened to? We know, for instance, that the climate protests of the Fridays for Futures were, they brought it to the awareness, but then if we see the farmers protesting in Brussels, they are more effective. So what is going on there? And I think what is also important for protests and claims in protest, we actually do not know, and I think there is also not much research about it, whether the democratic checks and balances are in place. So is it only the loudest voices, the most extreme voices that are heard? We don't know. So therefore, extremely important to check. Lower educated, they seem to exit politics altogether. If they are active in the electoral arena, they cast more populistic votes, they are less trusting and higher levels of effective polarization. If they want to protest, they are more repressed, higher barriers to protest. And the question is, are their voices, if they eventually made it through all the barriers, are their voices heard or not? Is it a fair playing field? All questions. And then the higher educated, overrepresented in electoral politics, overrepresented in protest politics, and they encounter less repression, and their protests are more facilitated. So they are already the most powerful group in society, and also in this arena, they are better listened to. Their voices are resonating in politics. So, and this is the last point, if we want to know whether the move from electoral to protest politics creates new democratic deficits, my argument would be then thoroughly study the democratic dance and check for the democratic outcomes. Representativity, which groups are presented in what arena, responsivity, what do authorities do? Do they listen? And are they held accountable by groups from the electoral and the protest arena? That was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating. But before we go on with questions and answers, maybe, I would like to ask online Aniko Imre whether she is with us, because in the program she is the next presenter. She is not on Zoom, so she has not connected, you mean? Well, it's a problem. We can wait, and please let me know in case you see her on Zoom. But then we continue, and we hope that Aniko will join us from Los Angeles sooner or later. So let's go to the questions first. We will collect some questions. The first one is Anna Kenda.
Do I need the microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Anna Kende from Eötvös Loránd University, and so basically it's a observation about your presentation and also some empirical evidence about different contexts of protest. So you present participation in protest as something that people turn to when they don't feel that they are heard in electoral politics, or they don't trust it, or so they move away because that seems to be more effective. Or it sounded like you have this assumption that the move away is driven by the idea that I am more heard when I'm participating in protests. But I think there is growing evidence that especially in repressive societies, this is not exactly the case. So people do not necessarily participate in protest because they believe that some change can be achieved. They participate in protest because they feel some moral outrage, they want to express their opinion, even if they do not believe that any change can be achieved or they can be heard. So I'm really curious how you would explain all of these changes when it comes to repressive societies, less democratic societies. Thank you.
Let's collect some more questions if there are more. Yeah, Jacek, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation, and it's very thought-provoking, but my immediate reaction, I have to say, is quite skeptical, mainly based on the Polish experience, but also, even if I looked at the slides you showed, this one claim about the move from electoral to protest politics. I mean, basically, you showed the participation in European elections actually increased in recent years, and there was a protest increase. So I just don't see that you can prove the correlation. You might look at these different groups, but then you end up with a problem of, I mean, percentage-wise it may make sense, but in terms of voters' participations, you talk about millions in an average European countries. Your criteria for protests was more than 10,000 people attending. So the theory that, for example, young people move from away from voting and to protests, I mean, most of them will do nothing, and there will be a small minority of eligible voters who would go to protests. So again, I think that there is a bit of a conceptual problem. That's one of my sort of skeptical comments. The other one is about the overrepresentation of the educated people in both protests and in protests and in elections. To be honest, it reminds me, this thesis reminds me very much of the populist rhetoric of our previous government. I mean, they tended to blame educated people for everything and troublemaking and being unhappy and being not true Polish people. And once again, the fact of the matter is, even if higher percentage of educated people turns out to vote, the sheer number of people with lower education is much higher in most countries, at least it is in Poland, and they can still unvote those with college degree. So actually saying that college education puts you in a privileged position in a democratic society is ambiguous. And then when it comes to protest politics, again, looking at the Polish example is, I think that actually the protests organized by certain groups, let's say, with less education, if you want to apply this criterion, that is farmers and miners in the Polish, and this is not just a recent year, this is for the last 30 years, have been much more effective and had disproportional impact on policies that protests, for example, by environmentalists, climate activists, animal welfare activists who are mainly higher education and who came in greater numbers, but they were not as aggressive as farmers and miners, and therefore the politicians didn't make sufficient effort. So again, on the face value, the hypothesis that people with higher education are overrepresented and disproportionately, let's say, empowered by both protest and voting, I think that I would question that, at least on the face values. And my final comment, again, from Polish, I will talk about it a bit more maybe tomorrow in my presentation, is actually that you could venture that protest politics actually leads to higher turnout rather than the other way around. So it's not either or. And the good examples are women's protests in Poland, which led to increase in women's participation in elections, not just the last one, but also in 2019. There was a very clear correlation. I will talk about it tomorrow, but also the young people. We had 8 years of populist government, and the first 4 years, there were quite big protests, but they were mainly by people over 50. And it was like almost a standing joke about the, we would go to a protest and meet everybody we saw in 1989. And then it changed in the second, especially again after the reproductive rights issue. And last year was a record high, and more young people went to streets to protest. And this year we had record high turnout among the young people. So again, completely opposite to the thesis that young people moved from voting to protest, because it was from protest to voting actually. In the Polish case, maybe we beat the trend, I don't know, but this is my skeptical comment, sorry.
Okay, I will have a short question to you, and then Kato, and that's the end of the first round. It's somehow similar to Jacek's approach, but my question is, maybe I'm less skeptical. Do you also mean that those who do not or haven't participated in the electoral process, they go and vote for the populist parties more and more, or you don't? Because I think from our liberal-minded perspective, that's the real danger. Protest is maybe not the best way if it's, a sort of protest which is related to violence and so on. But as you mentioned also, it might be part of the political regime that it's allowed to protest. And my second question is about the young people. So I understand that there is a danger, especially from the experience of the Netherlands, that people who are fed up with the political system go and become more and more extreme. But is it really so new phenomenon? I mean that social movements and political movements have been created since the 60s, and then young people were all fed up with the system. So they started to create quite radical political movements, and many of them later mitigated and have become, like the Greens, part of the regime. So is it a similar phenomenon, and we might become more optimistic at the end, that a young person goes to the street at the beginning, doesn't go to vote? And also this second part of the same question, the underclass, it has maybe also a tradition not participating in the elections. That's why we call it underclass, not in social terms, but in political terms. So is it so new, and that's why is it really dangerous, or it's a normal transition period for special political and social stratas, how they enter politics, like during the end of the 19th century when social democrats brought in underclass, that was the proletarians, or I don't know how to call them, and finally they became part of the political regime. Well, I don't want to talk about the 20th century, that's terrible, but on the long run, in the long run, they have become part of the political movements, and they had a party, the Social Democrats, which changed and became a leading political force. So Okay, Kata, now it's your turn.
Okay, just a very small question that the differences between these two types of political action cannot be explained by not the whole differences, but at least as an explanatory factor, the possible the big that they are very different in terms of frequency. So you can vote once in 5 years or once in 4 years, that's it. But in the meanwhile, quite a few outrageous things can happen which provoke a protest. So I just feel that they are very much different in terms of nature, and I am a bit doubtful if they can be put on the same comparable level. But it's indeed just as an observer. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's your turn.
Thanks you. This really helps me to strengthen the research. So thank you, and keep on going with all the thought-provoking questions. I take the liberty to combine the question of Koto and Anna, because they are a bit related, I think. Anna's question was on, first of all, why do people protest? And what outcomes do they envision? I wholeheartedly agree that some people go to a protest with the idea like, I want to change politics, or I want to confront authority. Others do that for more reasons of moral outrage. And then again, others, they really think like, I want to create awareness or whatever. So I think this differentiation is extremely important and is also related to the outcomes, the claims that they make. So if it's about awareness, you have a completely different claim than if it's about confronting authority. And therefore, we take these two together. At the level of the protests, we have a look what the claims are. And at the individual level of the protesters, we ask them, why do you actually protest? So if in trying to combine, we in a way bring together two strands of literature. One strand of literature which says people leave the electoral arena because they are annoyed with it, they distrust it, and then they go to the protest arena, as you started. But again, there is another strand of literature based on resource mobilization, who says, no, it's not like that. It is a resource for people who simply know when to do what types of action. Either they vote or they go onto the streets. And then, Kota, I come to your question. I couldn't agree more with your observation that the two are completely different and also run in a different rhythm, spontaneous or every 4 years. And in fact, what we did, and we built on that in this study, we did a study a few years ago, and the title of the study was In Between Elections. Here you go. And there we precisely studied what people want to do in between elections. It's issue focused, it's more on the constituency, so it's far more focused. And it's also in between elections, so you can, when the issue comes up, you can organize a protest or you can attend a protest. Completely different aspects, and how you can compare them is at the individual level. So what we make what we call repertoires of individual participation. So that is, we'd like to compose a measure of that. What type of political activities do people do? And what is your repertoire comprising? And in that way, we try to create prototypes, so to say. And I hope we then overcome the completely different nature of protests and elections. Jacek. Thanks. I really like your question, and especially about the correlations, because our way we approach the call of action of the Horizon Europe proposal was precisely in reaction to the points that you made. So in this call, they say elections are emptying and we see more protests. They come up with the data of the Eurobarometer that young people have more faith in protest than in politics, electoral politics. So we thought, okay, this is all very, very interesting, but it's scattered. And how can we connect them to create and understand the underlying dynamics? Why is it that this ends here and that ends there? And we thought that you can only study that if you look at the full democratic dance. So protest and elections, and the people, the citizens and the authorities. And therefore we think that only if you combine them, you can fully understand their dynamics of choice. So why do citizens do the one or the other? And is that indeed changing? Your, I would say, more socio-political context criticism, excellent, love it. And I do think we kind of tried to incorporate that in our study design, because we have a maximum variation in terms of democraticness. So we have Poland in our design, we have Egypt in our design, and we have the Netherlands in our design. And we want to study this whole dynamic, the whole underlying dynamic, and especially what people choose, what type of behavior of activities they choose if they want to influence politics. And the idea is indeed that the socio-political context influences that enormously. And I think that's also related to the question, might also be part of an answer to your question, the moral outrage and in contexts as Hungary, for instance. Yes, I couldn't agree more, and I think it's an extremely important point. And Egypt is going to be a challenge if it's about protests, so wish me luck. And then your question related to the farmers and the miners. So I called them bread and butter protests here in my notes. Very good point. I tried to address it when I said, so what is happening to, on the one hand, the Fridays for Futures, and on the other hand, the farmers? Yeah, there we see that the farmers are more effective in influencing politics than Fridays for Futures. And I think, first of all, that we need to be able to show that. But then I think we need to study and try to understand, why is it actually? Is it because they have a louder voice, because they are more extreme? Why is it that some groups are more effective than other groups? And we know a little bit about that, but I do think that some more systematic knowledge on that, comparative knowledge in different contexts and with different groups, I hope that will help us better understand it. Oh yeah, the women's protest, and that it went from protest to electoral participation. Interesting one. I'm not aware about any research into this, but that is why we want to study these individual repertoires of participation over the years. So we want to study how people try to influence politics, how that changes over years, and how that is influenced by changes in socio-political context. So I hope that we then will also be able to answer this question and show indeed that it's not only going from the electoral to the protest arena, but also the other way around. I'm not aware of any data on this at the moment, but I got it here, thanks. And then from, voters, I think it was your question, people who do not vote and that they eventually might vote for a populist, and that's a large concern. I think it's an extremely important one. We saw it in the Netherlands. I showed you the slide where Forum for Democracy won the elections unexpected, completely unexpected. And there we could see that a lot of non-voters eventually decided to vote for a populist party. I had a large discussion in a panel those days, and then one of my antagonists, you could say, he said, yeah, but this is simply democratic correction. These people enact their democratic right to participate. Yeah, well, if it's then for populists, we show what the effects are for the populists. So I think it's a concern, but we see this dynamic. Yes, indeed, yeah. Young people and extreme behavior. And whether that is a dynamic that we've seen since the 60s, yes, I agree with that. I do, however, think that at the moment this dynamic is different because of more splintering. Is that? Can I use that word? Anna, help!
Fragmentation.
Fragmentation. Yes. Fragmentation. First of all, we see much more fragmentation in political parties. We see more extremist political parties. We see more populist parties. Wherefore youngsters who want to be active, who want to influence their circumstances, their context, is less, perhaps, I think this is really also one of those dynamics that we need to study. Why is it that they deem it less effective? This might be one. And I'm not familiar, but we can check back to the 60s, whether people active in social movement organizations those days also had more faith in protest politics than electoral politics. I don't know. I really don't know. I think it's a lovely question, and I'm curious. And I think the same is for the underclass, right? It was also an example to. And Kotan's question on frequency, did I address it? Yes? Okay. That was it.
Thank you. We still have some time. Unfortunately, there is no reaction from Aniko Imre's side. I have an assumption that maybe she believes that we are 1 hour before because she's in Los Angeles. But that's, an idea what came to my mind. We don't know, actually. That might be a research question for the future.
Shall we ask her?
Yeah, well, it's difficult at the moment. Okay, any more questions? It's not obligatory because you might be tired and we are all a little bit at the end of our event without Aniko, unfortunately. But I still ask if there is any comment or question. If not, then we have a somewhat longer break. I mean, I'm talking to those who are invited to our special dinner at 7 o'clock, and we will meet at 6:30 in the lobby. And those who are not invited, please come back tomorrow early morning, and we will continue with our conference. Thank you for your participation. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.